On July 2024, Elon Musk tweets that America is headed for bankruptcy. He is not the only figure to send this warning.
As you may or may not have guessed, America is now bankrupt.
Bankrupt?
If this is true, what does this mean for the country? Will the dollar break? Higher taxes? Civil war? More memes from Elon Musk? We need to find out if the US is actually headed for bankruptcy, and perhaps a better question, what are the consequences of this?
It is a first in U.S. history, and it's not a good one. The national debt of the United States has exceeded $30 trillion for the very first time.
This debt is now the biggest vulnerability of the U.S., not an external enemy, but its own growing pile of debt, and it should worry the world.
We haven't seen this kind of debt since the Napoleonic Wars.
It could send the biggest economy in the world into a financial crisis.
It could send America into bankruptcy.
It could lead to no growth and stagnation.
And it can produce a form of civil war.
Or it could simply carry on and we just see business as usual. I'm gonna hit you with a statistic that nearly knocked me off my seat. 76% of personal income tax last month went to paying the interest on America's debt. Hang on, isn't our tax meant to educate the youth, help the old with social security, provide us with healthcare, maintain the highways? And you're telling me instead it's being used to pay the debt? And not pay off the debt, but just to pay the interest that the debt accumulates. This is not good.
I think we want to reduce the amount of spending that we're at least slow down the spending, because we're currently spending at a rate that is bankrupting the country. The interest payments on U.S. debt this year exceeded the entire Defense Department spending. If this continues, all of the federal government taxes will simply be paying the interest.
Not only did the payments exceed the defense spending, it also exceeded the spending on Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory spending, and income security. According to the CBO, by 2051, interest spending will become the largest category in the entire federal budget. And
in 3 to 4 years, the government will pay more in interest than they collect in taxes.
It is fair to say that
the American taxpayers are slaves to interest payments.
The U.S. debt is now $35 trillion. Stacked up in $1 bills, it would be equivalent to almost 8 of Chicago's 110-story Willis Tower. If we divide that per citizen, that is $104,000 each. Currently, the average full-time worker in America only makes $79,000.
This is not sustainable, and the problem is projected to get worse. From 2019 to 2022, the debt increased 40% as a result of the pandemic. Only 10 years ago, the debt was half of what it is today. $17 trillion went to $35 trillion. The US Treasury Department spends $1.8 billion to pay the interest on this. By 2033, that number will be closer to $4 billion. Many financial experts do not like this at all.
But I don't think it's a good idea to have it take up more and more of your income, because that sets a lot of other things in motion.
But I thought America was the great financial capital of the world. I thought that the dollar was the symbol of strength and dominance. Who let things get so out of control? To work out who caused this, we need to rewind a little bit through history. Franklin Roosevelt, recognize the name? Maybe not, he was president over 90 years ago, but this man plays a major role in the problem that we see today. Before 1933, you could go to a bank with $1 and directly exchange it for a dollar's worth of gold. This gold backing ensured that debt was kept in check. Because there's only a finite amount of gold, you cannot infinitely borrow. Roosevelt put a stop to this, and 38 years later, President Nixon finished the job. He completely removed America from the gold standard, and the US dollar was no longer backed by anything. It could be printed as much as the government pleased. Our parents were lying. Money does grow on trees, or at least at the click of the Federal Reserve's button. And this is why we've seen this happen.
The U.S. government is spending more money than they're making.
This is a graph that shows the history of government spending. Since that historic date in 1971, the government's deficit has got out of control. For 50 years, only 3 years have been a surplus, and the rest have been deficits on various scales.
In 2020, with the pandemic, things got really bad. We saw a deficit of $3.1 trillion. 3.1 is more than double the deficit after the Great Financial Crisis in 2008, and more than 7 times the deficit after the dot-com bubble collapse.
The federal budget deficit is insane. Federal expenditures are $7 trillion, federal revenue is $4 trillion. If this was a company, it'd be a $3 trillion loss. Something's got to give. You can't just spend $3 trillion more than you earn every year and don't expect something bad to happen. This is not good.
Because money was now effectively free, the government was not afraid to borrow so that it could spend. But what are they spending all this money on? Well, in 2020, the country got shut down and this thing called stimulus payments were given out. Remember them? Let's just say they weren't cheap.
A lot of money was sent out in the form of checks and the like, and went out to a lot of people.
In total, the stimulus checks cost the government $5 trillion.
But it's not just stimulus checks. There's also been a few wars started where America has kindly stepped in to help. As you can imagine, this was not cheap either.
The United States has spent or sanctioned around $8 trillion on its wars. These wars were financed almost entirely through debt.
We've also had some bank failures come about. Someone had to bail them out, right? On a fair value basis, it's estimated by MIT that those bailouts cost around $498 billion. Then you factor in student loan forgiveness, all of the regular spending on Social Security, education, Medicare, interest on the debt, highway maintenance, and it doesn't surprise you how they rack up constant deficits.
Like, we have a crazy budget deficit.
These deficits make the debt worse every year they occur, and because they've occurred for so long, this is why the debt is so bad. The people who own the debt make a fortune, and the American people suffer.
And then the question becomes, hang on, who are these people that own the debt?
Because one man's debts are another man's assets.
Well, there are two kinds of national debt. You've got debt held by the public and what's called intragovernmental debt, which is debt held by the government itself. The largest, around 80%, is held by the public, and a big portion of this is held by foreign governments. Topping this list is Japan with $1.1 trillion owned. China is second, owning $870 billion. The UK holds $645 billion. Belgium holds $330 billion. Luxembourg $313 billion. And the Cayman Islands owns $283 billion. Yeah, if you know, you know. These countries are the ones who receive the interest payments on the debt because they own it. They don't own all of it, but they own a decent portion of it. The rest is owned by mutual funds, insurance companies, private pension funds, banks, and other investors.
About 40% of our debt is sold to foreigners, and so there is a concern.
It would be fair to say that something is drastically wrong when government spending is going towards paying other countries and helping institutions instead of going towards helping the American people.
So if we're just constantly losing money each year, does this mean we really are headed for bankruptcy? Now we need to get quite sophisticated, because it is a big claim to say that America is headed for bankruptcy. As we've established, the debt is big, but everything is relative, right? An ant is big compared to an atom. A Jack Russell is big compared to a mouse. Is America's debt big compared to its economy? Well, we've got the perfect graph to test this out. It's called the debt to GDP graph. Debt meaning total national debt, and GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced. Kind of like a way to measure how powerful a country's economy is.
A growing debt balance may not be all that concerning if a country's size is keeping pace regarding its economic output, which is why economists often look more towards a country's debt to GDP when trying to gauge a country's debt burden. So, how's debt to GDP been doing in the US? Well, not so great either.
You're absolutely right, it's not great. The debt to GDP ratio is currently 122%, meaning debt is not smaller than GDP, it's not the same as GDP, it's bigger than it. Just to put that into perspective, 16 years ago, the ratio was only half this at 60%. 46 years ago, it was only a quarter of this at 30%. And if you look at other countries, the UK's debt to GDP is 100%, India is 83%, China is 77%, Australia's is 55%, the UAE is 25%, and Russia is only 20%. You also have Japan, which is the one major country ahead of America in this ratio. But the average country has a 61% debt to GDP ratio. With double the average, it's fair to say that America's debt is large. In fact, the last time we saw the debt this large was in the Second World War, where America basically had to go into a lot of debt to fund the war.
That figure, I think at the end of World War II, I know it was around at least 125% or so of GDP.
We're kind of at the same place today. So if the debt is so high compared to how much money we're bringing in GDP, how do we actually afford this? Well, the answer always has been, we keep on borrowing money, and then the debt grows more, and then we have to pay more interest, so we borrow even more, and then the debt grows again, and we pay more interest, so we borrow more, and...
If this continues, all of the federal government taxes will simply be paying the interest, and you keep going down that road, and you end up, in the tragic situation that Argentina had back in the day. Argentina used to be one of the most prosperous places in the world.
It certainly seems we're at a crossroad and a decision has to be made. If a patient has bad cancer and he doesn't get chemo, he will die. The United States is kind of like that cancer patient. If the country does not make drastic moves, they simply drown in debt. But what are these moves? Will they be painless, an easy pill to swallow, or will they be more like the chemo process? You can look at other countries as case studies for what might happen in America. Japan once had the same amount of debt to GDP as America has now. But what happened to Japan? It was once the second largest economy in the world, remember? Did they solve their debt? Did they end up going bankrupt? Did they see hyperinflation? Actually, none of those. What happened was their debt pile just kept getting worse and worse and worse, but their economy basically stayed the same. In fact, right now their GDP is less than what it was 30 years ago in 1995. In economics, you always hear about Japan's lost decade. It's actually more like Japan's lost triple decade. If the US doesn't make some big changes, they could be the next Japan. Just more debt, no growth, stagnation, overtaken by other countries. That's one move they can make, but there are other moves that can be made to fix this. If we want to solve this crisis and not drown in debt, we have two key moves to make. One is cut spending and increase taxes. If you have less expenses and more revenue, you get rid of the deficits, make a surplus, and use that surplus to pay off the debt. But this does mean less money on Medicare, on roads, on defense, on social security, and everything else that we usually spend on. Also, these tax rates that you see over here, they all go up, and they're not exactly at record lows at the moment. But if this does happen, you get the American citizens to pay more to the government so that the government can pay its debt that it's accumulated over the years.
I know that doesn't sound right, but it's reality.
You have to raise taxes dramatically because you can't cut the spending quickly enough, and that's just a horrific place to go.
Our second option is we print money to pay the debt. As they say, if you can't earn it legitimately, you can always print it.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
It sounds like such an easy solution, but this comes with consequences too.
These consequences are best explained by this Elon Musk tweet. First, you start with physical money, like silver, that can't be printed. Then, have paper money, which is backed by silver. Third, you have fake money, which can't be converted into anything. And then, you get inflation, which turns to hyperinflation, where like Zimbabwe, you can be a quadrillionaire, but can barely afford to buy bread.
This is the problem that comes with money printing. You cause inflation and your currency is devalued.
What does that mean, printing that kind of quantity of money? That means that is inflation. That's a definition of inflation. Printing money is inflation.
We actually had a small taste of this recently where the Fed printed money to help in the pandemic, which led to the follow-on effect of inflation. It wasn't big inflation, historically speaking, but enough to feel the effect of it. This inflation money printing option here is the most likely one that they will take because it's the easier choice. No one wants higher taxes, no one wants reduced spending, no one wants the hardship that comes with lowering the debt.
The debt isn't going to be paid, it's going to be refunded. And anybody that thinks they're going to bring down the national debt, I mean, there's been brief periods, and I think it's in the late 90s or thereabouts, when the debt's come down a little bit. The country's going to print more debt.
Printing for the debt is the easy choice, but easy choices in the present cause hardship in the future. And that's something that's always been clear, no matter how many people try to tell us that we can print money infinitely.
We're no longer on a gold standard, so finding the money to pay for the things we need is never an issue. Spending trillions to support the economy during the pandemic, to me, that was fiscally responsible.
Fiscally responsible? Yeah, right. We now have a taste of what small levels of inflation feels like, but what are large levels like? We might just find that out.